Good evening and welcome to our Camera on Campus online conversation. My name is Hallie Haber and I'm the Director of Campus Programming and Strategic Relationships. We are happy to have all of you here participating in our conversation titled Celebrate Israel with Shai Deluca, the Zionism you won't hear about on campus. In a moment, I'll be introducing our speaker. Before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Camera and Camera on Campus. Camera is a nonpartisan media research organization. We aim to correct inaccurate information presented in the media. In the campus department, we focus on correcting misinformation in the campus papers, classrooms, and through guest speakers. We provide assistance to students through our two programs, the Camera on Campus Coalition and the Camera Fellowship. Our Camera Fellows are writing articles in their campus papers, responding to biased and inaccurate articles, and hosting educational events and writing workshops. We train our students to expose and correct misinformation spread about Israel and proactively educate about Israel and the conflict. They do this through our annual summer international training conference and through guidance from our staff and researchers throughout the year. We are currently accepting applications for the Camera Fellowship, and we'll send the link out in a follow-up email, as well as a registration link for our upcoming event this Monday, where we're going to be diving more into all of our programs. So this evening, we're hoping to have this conversation be as interactive and engaging as possible. So while our speaker will be presenting at first, there will be time at the end for you to ask questions. If you feel comfortable, we would love for everyone to turn on their cameras so that we can all feel like we're together in the same room. Please mute yourself, but again, there will be an opportunity for you to unmute yourself when our staff calls on you. Please make yourself aware of the Zoom functions at the bottom of your screen. This evening, we're going to be using the raise hand and the chat functions. So when you click on the participants button at the bottom of the page, you will see the raise hand function pop up on the right side of your screen at the bottom of the participants list. So please use this button when you would like to be called on to speak during Q&A. And if you have a question during the event, you can write it in the chat box. So to get things started, please introduce yourself in the chat box now with your first name and what city you're joining us from. And while you do that, I'd like to thank the ICC and the Coalition for partnering with us on this event. Please check out yomfromhome.com to find out more events that you can attend during Yom Ha'atzmaut week. And it is my pleasure to introduce Shai Deluca. Shai is an internationally acclaimed celebrity designer and television personality. He is the founder and president of his award-winning interior design studio, but is most well known for his television and media career as the design expert for North America's leading lifestyle program, Cityline. Shai hails as one of North America's most prominent Israelis in media and television and served proudly as an openly gay sergeant in the IDF. Shai began to battle the frightening rise of anti-Semitism, predominantly on college campuses and university campuses, when he partnered with Camera on Campus in 2018 as part of his desire to uphold the tenets of truth and accuracy in media reporting in the Middle East while educating the leaders of tomorrow. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Shai and enjoy this evening's conversation.
Thank you so much, Hallie. I'm really excited to be here, guys. Alan Noam, I see somebody wrote me a message that Alan. I don't know, Douglas, I know that you're fixing the screens here. I can only see myself and it's fine. Just in case I need to see anybody else, I don't know if you can change that screen for me. So basically, guys, what I wanted to talk to you about today is exactly like Hallie was saying. We're going to talk a little bit about Zionism, but Zionism that you guys don't hear about on campus. Before we get into the presentation, however, for those of you who don't know who I am or who have not been to one of my talks that I've had through Camera, I'll just give a little bit of background about myself. Exactly like Hallie said, I live in Toronto now. I am an interior designer by profession. I left Israel to study interior design in New York in 2001. And I've been back and forth since. I opened up my very first design studio. Of course, I wanted to do it back home in Israel. And after I did that, I was able to branch out into Canada and the US as well. In terms of why it is that I'm doing what I'm doing with you guys right now, and Hallie really hit the nail on the head. You know, in 2014, for those of you who don't remember, there was the Gaza war in Israel, and that really set me on a path in terms of somebody who's in the media eye anyway, to really need to speak out against the misinformation that we're really seeing in media, and then of course in the halls of academia. And there was no better organization to partner with than Camera, because this is what they do. This is the core of who they are, and it's really important to weed out all that misinformation first, and then of course build from that. Now, in terms of what we're going to do tonight, it's super lax, super easy. Ask a question whenever you want. There is a Q&A at the end of it, of course. But what I want to do is kind of have a really kind of relaxed discussion about what Zionism is. I might, if my technical abilities allow me to, I might throw up a slide every so often for you guys to kind of get an idea as to what my talking points are, and we can talk to that. And then I'll bring it back to myself, and we can go from there. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. First, let's talk about, what Zionism is based on what we understand from what we hear in academia versus what it really is. So when we talk about Zionism and what is Zionism, the Zionism that you don't hear about on campuses, what do we hear on campuses? We hear that Zionism is racism. We hear that Zionism is bigotry. We hear that Zionism is Islamophobic. We hear all these different things about Zionism, and not one of those things is actually what Zionism is. So I think it's really important, especially nowadays, when we see in the halls of academia, at your universities, at your colleges, when there is so much anti-Israel rhetoric that is happening, not only within the student body, but it's really getting a push, and it's really getting support from the staff as well. So we really need to make sure that our voices are heard. It's no surprise that it's very difficult to walk into a campus that is so against who you are or what you believe yourself to be, and really have that come at you from all different areas. I just to give a little bit more of a background before we get into the presentation. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity to go with Camera to the UK. And as bad as it is in the US, in the UK, I'd walk onto campuses and there would be people who would rush in groups. They would rush me, not to physically harm me, but to yell at me for things that really I hadn't even spoken yet. The simple fact that I was Israeli and I was on their campus was problematic enough for them. So that right there really goes to show you what kind of mindset we're looking at. We're not looking, a lot of these people are not looking to talk to people. A lot of these people are looking to repeat talking points that they've heard, but really don't know much about what it really is about. So I think our job is definitely to educate as much as we possibly can when it comes to what Zionism really is, and maybe start a conversation to really move people from where they are or what they believe Zionism to be to what it actually is. Okay, so I'm going to throw this up on the screen. Give me 1 second, and please bear with me. Oh, I can't throw it up on the screen because it's not letting me. Okay, so Douglas, I'm going to have to rejoin on my iPad the Zoom call because for some reason, oh, there we go. There we go. Sorry, guys, technologically bad. So I'm going to figure this out. Give me 1 second. I'm going to start this. And all right, there we go. Look at that. I did it. Okay. So let's get to the first slide. So the first slide really here, what I wanted to do is we are all, of course, purveyors of social media. We are on social media constantly. We're talking about social media constantly. A lot of the things that we see on social media are problematic as it refers to Zionism, because there are all these people in the media who are so quick to redefine what Zionism is without actually knowing what it is. And social media is great for a lot of things, but for a lot of things, obviously, it deters and it causes problems. So, I went on to just kind of pull out, you do hashtag or do a search for Zionists and all the different things that you can find online. Zionists transforming anti-Semitism from something horrible into something honorable since 1948. Israel, born to British colonialism, created through Zionist terrorism, supported by Western imperialism, sustained by fake anti-Semitism. I mean, these are just two of the really kind of perverse things that we're seeing online as it comes to and refers to Zionism. And the question is why? Why is this happening? We're going to get into that in a second, but do we see such perversity when it comes to, self-determination for any European country, Italians, Greeks, Germans, French? Do we see this in African countries? Do we see this in Far East countries? All of these countries serve their native indigenous people as well as others, and yet it always seems to be that the only people who shouldn't or couldn't, in the eyes of a lot of people, serve their own national and indigenous interests are the Jews. So one of my favorite places to go on, some of you might have seen this slide in some of the presentations that I've done for you guys. One of my favorite places to go on is, of course, Urban Dictionary, because I find Urban Dictionary, especially at night when you're tired and you're just looking for a laugh. If you go on Urban Dictionary, you can find the things that are kind of hot topics now in terms of what's popular, and to see how they're defined in an urban kind of modern setting. So Zionism, a race supremacist settler colonial political ideology that hijacks both Judaism and Christianity, responsible for apartheid, ethnic cleansing, sadistic materialism, and moral hypocrisy in Israel. I mean, not even one of those. Well, they got Israel right, but the rest of it is just it's garbage, right? And of course, Urban Dictionary, we take it for what it is. But a lot of people will go on this, and the younger generation especially, and see this and say, you know what, whether or not it's a joke or not, there's got to be some truth into what it is that I'm seeing. So let's talk about what Zionism is. What is Zionism? Because we know what it's not. But what's really important, guys, especially for you on campuses, whether you go back this year, you're going back next year, whether it's just in conversation at a party, it's really important to make sure that if you're going to have this conversation with people, that we all are under the same understanding that Zionism is what it is. We all have to make sure that we understand the true definition so that there's not miscommunication as when it comes to, what is it and how do we apply it. So what is Zionism, guys? The right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our indigenous homeland. That's all it is. It doesn't talk about rights of other people. It doesn't talk about, the specifics of how it's going to, none of that. All it talks about is the one right that most ethnicities in the world have is the right to self-determination in their nation state or in their, their homeland. And I want to stop and kind of emphasize the fact that people will say, Israel doesn't need to be Israel. You don't need to have a specifically Jewish country. I stop people right there all the time and I say, well, hold on a second. If Jews shouldn't have a Jewish country or the ethnic homeland of the Jewish people or the native homeland of the Jewish people, what about every single country in Europe? Every single one of those countries is essentially the ethnic or the nation homeland of its indigenous people. Italy, Italians, Germans, French, so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that other people don't live there. That doesn't mean that other people are not German by citizenship or Italian by citizenship and don't live under fully equal laws within that country. It just means that that country originated under the ethnicity or the traditions of a certain people. It grew, it developed. That has become the kind of core, the heart of that nation, and that's it. But for some reason, Zionism, specifically when it comes to the Jews, no, that's not okay. And this right here, guys, is where this underlying anti-Semitism kind of comes in. And we'll get to that in a little bit because we really want to concentrate now on the Zionism aspect of it. Zionism is not racism. Zionism is not apartheid. Zionism is not all those things that people are going to talk to you about. Zionism is, of course, the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our indigenous homeland. So when you're having that talk, guys, you really want to start off with that. Now, in terms of what we can do to combat this, so we will talk many times about, we can argue, all these different things that you see which are happening on campuses or on social media. It's really difficult and sometimes really disheartening to see what people have to face when somebody finds out that A, you're Jewish, or B, that you're Israeli, or C, that you support Israel and support indigenous rights in Israel. It becomes problematic because it almost takes a turn from, oh, okay, I don't have a problem with you because you're Jewish. I have a problem with you because you are Zionist. And my response to that is always the same. So you're okay with me being Jewish. The only thing you're not okay with is my right to self-determination. You're not okay with my indigenous rights. Do you fight Native Indigenous rights in the US? Do you fight Native Indigenous rights in Australia? Do you fight Native Indigenous rights anywhere else in the world? Or is it only for the Jewish people? What I want to do, and I've done this with a couple of you guys in the past, but I feel like this is a really great way to kind of talk about what we hear and then what is the truth. So we're going to go through a whole bunch of things when it comes to Zionism specifically, and then I want to kind of bring it back and end up at LGBT rights in Israel as it pertains to Zionism as well. So let's talk about myths versus fact. This is the myth that I hear, but what is the fact that is actually, the truth? Because when we are fighting against those people who are spreading misinformation, the only way to do it in a way that's actually going to affect or create change in that conversation is going to be providing facts versus the myth. So let's get to the first myth. The reestablishment of the state of Israel was unfair to Arabs. That's the myth that we hear all the time. There are people who are living there. You made them go away. You kicked 700,000 people out. All these different things that we're hearing. Let's talk about the facts. Fact, in 1948, the partition attempted to create two states for two peoples. That was always the deal. Two states for the two peoples living on that land, one Arab, one Jewish. We can talk about how that partition was supposed to happen, but that was always the fair split. The original partition was to delegate Transjordan as the Arab state, while giving the land to the west of the river to the Jewish people. So everything, including Judea and Samaria, was supposed to be Israel. Everything from the east of the river, which is now Jordan, which was then Transjordan, was supposed to be for the Arab population or the Palestinian population. Next myth. Over the years, Israel has taken land from Palestine. All right, well, I know you guys have heard this before, and I know you guys have definitely seen these maps before. So let's talk to this, because this is one that I get thrown, if not 3, 4, 5 times a day, and I'm not exaggerating. This is always the map that people throw at me. And the fact is, no sovereign country ever was taken over to create the state of Israel. The Middle East, if you want to look at the history of the Middle East, it's a combined history. There was a lot of land that was split up through sectarian splits, whether it was Arab and Jew, whether it was Arab and Arab, Sunni, not Sunni, whatever it was. The Middle East is a very different way in which it runs and the ways in which it splits, as opposed to North America. Now, in North America, you'll hear all the time people will say, oh, well, you took land that wasn't yours, you took land that wasn't yours. It was Palestine beforehand. And my answer to that is always the same. It was not Palestine beforehand, because before Palestine, it was called something else. You're choosing to start your history when the colonial forces who arrived in Judea, the kingdom of the Jews, decided to change it to Palestine. So it's interesting that you, somebody who claims to be, and it's usually people who claim to be progressive and very kind of forward thinking, it's very interesting that you, somebody who's progressive, chooses to use the colonial name for a country rather than what the indigenous population call it. And I know for a lot of people in North America and South America, where these two big bodies of land have really been colonized by, the French, the English, the Spanish, whatever, a lot of these people have difficulty saying, you know what, it's okay that the indigenous population came back and is now ruling themselves. That's the way it should be. In the United States, you guys are still fighting for this. Here in Canada, of course, reservations for the native populations. The native populations are fighting for self-determinations on their part of the land within the country. So why is it then that Israel or Jews can't do the same? Okay, myth. The partition gave proportionately too much land to the Jews. I always like this one, because if you look at a map of the entire Middle East, that always makes me laugh. It's this tiny little piece speck, Israel, and you see the rest of the Middle East, which is so much larger. But let's get to it. The fact. The portion of the land allocated to Jews had a substantial Jewish majority. So what does that mean? If you look at the map and the way in which the partition was done and talk about Transjordan versus Israel now, what you can also look at, of course, is the partition the way that it was in 1948. So the land that was given to Jews as it was split was predominantly Jewish. There were mostly Jewish people living in those parts of the land, which is why it was split the way that it was split. 538,000 Jews versus 397,000 Arabs. And those are UN estimates. So depending on where it was, but overall, we're looking at these numbers. You'll hear, no, there were way more Arabs. No, we can look at the UN numbers, and we can kind of break this down into a whole bunch of different things to try to understand when the numbers started to spike, When did people start to immigrate? When did we start to see, you know, these waves of immigration coming into what was then Palestine, the British Mandate Palestine? And you'll notice that, and people don't want to talk about it, but after 1897, after the first Zionist Congress at the end of the 1800s, you saw large portions of the Arab communities from surrounding countries come into Israel because the governments from around the country, or the rulers from around the country, around Israel, noticed or understood that there were going to be a lot of Jews who were going to be returning home. They wanted to be able to change the balance in the amount of population, Arab versus Jew. As the original partition included Jordan, or what was then Transjordan, the League of Nations in 1920, in fact, 80% of the land went to Arabs. So it's not fair for people to come to you and say, you know, too much land was taken for the Arabs and given to the Jews, unless you are honest about the fact that we need to talk about the partition the way that it was supposed to be. Transjordan, Arab, Israel, or what was then British Mandate Palestine, for the Jewish people. So if you have these two kind of bodies of land, you realize that at the end of the day, Jews not only ended up with less than what they were supposed to get, because now all of a sudden the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, or Judea and Samaria, are now included in what was supposed to be Arab land. Had the original partition happened and the Jews received the land that they were supposed to, as opposed to the land that we saw in actually given in the mandate, it was only actually 80%. And then if you actually take it down and go further and then understand that once Judea and Samaria were taken out, once the Golan was taken out, once the Gaza Strip, and at the beginning the Gaza Strip actually went a little bit longer along the Egyptian border, once those things were taken out, what were the Jews left with? 17.5% of the original land promised. 17.5%, guys. So, you know, to hear people say proportionately Jews got too much land, that's not true. It's not, it's an easy talking point. And if you want to start history only from 1948, then that's fine, but that's not the correct fact. So let's fight that myth with the correct fact, use numbers. These are all UN numbers. Okay, next myth. Jews stole land from the Arabs. Now, this one is always a favorite of mine because no. Because just no. So fact, Jews were unhappy with the final tally of the land division, but accepted it nonetheless. We just spoke about that, guys. 17.5% of what was supposed to be the Jewish homeland is all we received. And what did we do? We accepted. We said, fine. We said, at this point, what is important for us is our safety and our right to self-determine within our indigenous homeland. So whatever that is, we're willing to accept. Britain had allocated approximately 190,000 acres of cultivatable land to the Arabs and approximately 4,500 acres to the Jews. So think about that. Think about what the original partition was supposed to be. Judea and Samaria, which is, or the middle part of Israel, the northern parts of Israel, which are the most fertile in terms of land, were not predominantly given to the Jews. They were predominantly given to the Arab population. We were given the coastline, we were given the Negev, we were given, you know, parts that were very difficult to, you know, to grow and to cultivate. Ben Gurion, at the beginning, he always spoke about l'afriach et hashmama. He was going to make the desert bloom. Everything that you saw nothing was going to be something. And we did it. I mean, you don't have to look at the Negev, and you don't have to look at the parts that are a little bit more destitute right now, but look at Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a great example because Tel Aviv was nothing. It was dunes, sand dunes. And look at it now. You know, it compares to cities like Miami or New York in a warmer kind of sense. But it is so amazing to see how far we've come, even with the small amount of land that we were given. Now, we talk about theft versus land purchase. And this is one I hear all the time as well is, you know, Jews stole the land, Jews don't have deeds, Jews don't. All these things, of course, are incorrect. It's very easy to find Ottoman records, to find British records of sales of land from Arabs to Jews. This is something that was happening. You know, Arabs were not looking to, especially after a lot of them, I'm not talking about the governments who then moved their populations in, but a lot of people found out, you know, Jews were moving in. Here's, you know, some a stretch of land that's all sandy. I don't need it. I'm not going to use it for anything. Let me sell it. And they did. And the thing was, is, you know, they weren't they weren't this smart or unsmart about it. They were looking to make money, and they did. They sold land, and this is, remember guys, this is way back when, like in the 40s, some estimates were that $1,000 an acre was how much land was going for. $1,000 an acre. So think at that time, $1,000 an acre was a lot of money. But this premium was worth it for many of the Jewish population that came there, because they understood that, listen, without it, we don't have our homeland. We are willing to buy our homeland back, even though we weren't given that same consideration when we were forced to leave. A large percentage of the land purchased by Jews came from large landowners, including guys, mayors of Gaza, Jerusalem, and Jaffa. So think about that. That's always an interesting point. The mayors, the Arab mayors of these cities that had Arab populations in them, were selling their land. So you can say anything that you want to say about the land purchases and, oh, maybe, you know, they didn't know what they were selling. You know, I've heard a whole bunch of things. They didn't know what they were selling. They didn't realize how valuable it was. They didn't think, they didn't, back and forth. At the end of the day, a land purchase is a land purchase. At the end of the day, a deed is a legal document. So, you know, to say that Jews were stealing land is just it's a full out lie. But to really push that narrative is hurtful in the sense that not only did we not steal, but we were actually, you know, people took advantage of the fact that Jews were looking to buy this land, and they were charging them amounts of money that were absolutely astronomically ridiculous. This is one of my favorite slides, guys, because this really goes to speak to what it is that I'm talking about. And, you know, you'll hear people say, you're Israeli, you're biased, you don't know what you're saying, or you don't know the truth. Well, let's look to our neighbors. Who were our neighbors at that time? This is from the memoir of King Abdullah of Jordan. Okay, what did he say? Arabs are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in weeping about it. And we can talk from now until the end of time about how horrible, you know, the Arab rulers were to their population. You know, we can talk about that. And do I think that this is, you know, put in is this quote, you know, said nicely? Probably not. Is it true? 100%. But at the end of the day, this is what was happening. These were legal land purchases that were happening. This was the dream, the Zionist dream was coming back to our homeland, purchasing land, cultivating it, and creating our state. Okay, myth. Jews forced Arabs into exile following the Independence War. I mean, there's no better slide than this. This is one of my favorite memes. Really? I mean, let's be honest about what happened then, shall we? Many Arabs did leave their homes. And I think that one of the things that you guys need to really make sure that you are comfortable with is when you are discussing Zionism and when you are learning about Zionism, when you are debating Zionism, whatever it is, you have to be willing to be honest about the hard stuff, but understand that that hard stuff either was because of something or, you know, there were reasons for the ways that everything kind of transpired. I always like to throw back at people that want to come at me and say, oh, you know, 1948, if Israel never happened, then, you know, everything would be fine. And I'll always throw back at them and I'll say, well, that's ridiculous because Israel happened the same day that Palestine happened, but one group of people accepted, the other didn't. So if you want to ask why things are the way that they are, I always say this, you and I probably wouldn't be having this conversation had the Arab population accepted the partition. It wouldn't have even been a population. Nobody would have had to flee because of war. Nobody would be running away from anywhere. You know, have to remember 20% of our population in Israel is Arab. These are the descendants of those who decided to stay. These are not people who, you know, came afterwards. Some did, but a lot of them are the descendants of people who decided to stay in 48. So, well, many Arabs did leave their homes because of what was happening. We have to remember why. Syrian Prime Minister Khalid al-Azzam at the time said, since 1948, we have been demanding the return of refugees to their homes, but we are the ones who encourage them to leave. Yes, they are the ones who encourage them to leave. And some of you might have heard this before, some of you might not. The reason that a lot of the Arab nations surrounding Israel said, listen, if you leave, a lot of these populations, let's remember for a second that a lot of these populations were actually moved by their own governments, you know, or by their own rulers, Syria, Transjordan, Egypt, into what was then British Mandate Palestine, because they realized that they would have otherwise an imbalance of populations, Jewish versus Arab. So they were telling these people to move. But the Syrian PM, was honest enough about the fact that he said, we keep telling them, demanding the return of these refugees, but we were the ones who told them to leave because they were the ones who said to them, you guys don't have a military, British mandate, or what was then supposed to be Palestine. You don't have a military. Let us do the work for you. Leave your homes for a week to let us, and this is where the quote comes from, let us push the Jews into the sea, and then you guys can come back and, live your lives as you were. And how sad, because think, just that one thing in history, had that one different, made that decision differently and said, you know what, I'm going to be like the 20% of who are now Israeli citizens and stay, and I'm going to, thrive in my new country. No, I decided then to leave, hoping that the other armies were going to push the Jews into the sea. Much to my dismay, here I am now. Okay, the higher Arab executive clearly intimidated those Arabs that remained in Haifa and accepted Jewish protection. So when I talk about, a minute ago, I was saying a lot of these Arabs decided to stay and, be within the newly created, or the newly recreated Israeli population. A lot of the Arab, whether it was residents or countries around, threatened a lot of these Arab citizens of now Israel who decided to stay and saying, if you guys stay, you are going to be seen almost as an enemy, And Israel was the one who said, no, you stay, you are under the protection of the government of Israel because you are now Israeli. And that's where we see the disparity, kind of the divide within the Arab population of those who say, I'm Israeli Arab, that's who I am, that's my identity, I am proud of the fact that that's who I am, versus a lot of these Palestinians who weren't part of those people who said, you know what, we're going to stay, we're going to, we're going to help cultivate. We understand that this is the Jewish homeland, but we're here, we're still citizens of this newly created country, and we want to be part of it. So where does that leave us today, guys? I mean, where does that leave us today? We are now at this point where Zionism is a bad word. We are at a point where we only have 17.5% of what our original mandate was supposed to be. We have this huge chunk of land in kind of the heart of Israel, which is Judea and Samaria, which is now disputed land. What do? We're hearing all these things from all these countries. International law says, the ICC says, all these different things are saying, you guys are wrong. Why is it that nothing has happened up until now? So I want to talk about sovereignty, the term sovereignty, versus occupation in international law. So sovereignty, for those of you who don't know, a sovereign country is a country that rules itself. It has its borders, its law, its constitution, its courts, so on and so forth, is a self-sustaining country. Whereas occupation, which is a word that we're hearing a lot, I don't like to use because I don't think it applies, and I'll explain why, versus international law. Now, international law is a big one. That's the one that you're going to hear. International law says, international law says, international law says. Well, what does international law say, and what is it essentially? International law is nothing more than a set of laws that the world have come together and said, yeah, we agree that this should be a law, this should be a law, this should be a law, this should be a law. Does international law circumvent or trump sovereign law in any nation? No. So, you can talk about international law from now until the end of time. But international law is an agreed upon set of rules. If you don't agree upon them, then where does that leave you? It leaves you within and under the umbrella of your sovereign law. So sovereign law is your country's laws. The myth that Zionism enforces a brutal occupation over a sovereign Arab people, of course, is wrong. You can't talk about Jewish self-determination or Zionism without talking about the disputed territories. Now, I want to say and focus and kind of emphasize on the fact that I use, and I would suggest you do too, use the term disputed territories rather than occupied territories. I know that the UN says, I understand that the UN says this is an occupied land, whatever, because they ascribe to a certain set of international laws. But one of kind of the rules of thumb, and this is something that's kind of debated a lot, and this is what I go off of. Most legal minds, most legal, kind of legal geniuses out there will tell you, Alan Dershowitz was a great one for this, he will tell you that occupation cannot happen in the land that was not sovereign. So what does that mean? Had Israel come and, taken over Judea and Samaria from, if it was Jordan or if it was Syria or if it was any of those other countries that had annexed it legally. And then, then we are talking about an occupied piece of land. But because Judea and Samaria from 1948 was never accepted as a Palestinian state, the Palestinians did not accept it. They vetoed their part of the agreement. So they did not accept it. This is now no longer sovereign Palestine. This is a disputed piece of land. Critics cite that the UN Resolution 242 as proof to Israel's occupying land, not our own, and not having withdrawn from the occupied territories. But again, I want to go back to the UN can say what they want is according to their international law understanding. But there is a reason at the end of the day that Israel, as long as it has, and I want to put aside, don't tell me it's because of the US or don't tell me it's because of all the other things. There's a reason that Israel has been able to kind of fight this for as long as we have, because it is so unclear when it comes to this idea of international law versus what is actually on the ground. International law oftentimes will become law because of things and legislation passed in the UN. But is the UN a legal body? No. So it's so kind of up in the air. And that's why for as long as we have, we've been debating this for as long as we have. So according to the resolution, Israeli withdrawal was to take place in the context of the Arab recognition of the state of Israel. So let's talk a little bit about 1967 versus 1948. 1967, all of a sudden, Israel gained this land mass, which was taken over from an illegal occupation of Jordan of that area. 1948, the War of Independence happened. Israel had their parts of land. Jordan then illegally occupied what was then Judea and Samaria, was supposed to be the Palestinian state. And they occupied it illegally until 1967, or stayed in there until 1967. They never annexed it. But the resolution was always supposed to be that in order for the Jews to withdraw from, or the Israelis to withdraw from what was then that disputed piece of land, what we then need to look at is, well, okay, so it's not disputed land, or sorry, it is disputed land. It's not land taken over. But the idea on the flip side is that the Arab nations needed to recognize the Jewish state, and they never did. We're seeing that slowly now, but at that time they never did. Myth: Israel is an apartheid state. I mean, this one is it's ridiculous. Apartheid, anybody who knows anything about apartheid knows that apartheid has two sets of legal rules for two peoples living under one government. Any Israeli, Arab, Jew, Christian, Muslim, whatever, who is an Israeli citizen is, of course, equal under the law, 100%. So there is no apartheid. You cannot talk about the laws within Judea and Samaria because that's something completely different. That's Oslo, and we can get into that, but that's a completely separate thing. There is no apartheid, and it's a word that you shouldn't use, and it's a little bit offensive to a lot of these South African people who I've met and kind of discussed with when it comes to what is apartheid. I've been to Israel. It's not what I've seen in South Africa. It's not what I've experienced. Okay, so myth: the security wall is a tool to impose apartheid. The security wall, guys, what is the security wall? Those of you who have been to Israel, and I'm assuming most of you have, know that this is a tiny portion. The portion that you're seeing here is a tiny portion of a larger fence. Now, the security wall, I mean, I lived in Israel when the security wall went into effect. And what we saw there was that
just a moment, folks.
Boy, guys, I don't know what happened.
You're back online, Shai.
I'm back online now. Okay, perfect. Let me put this. I need this now. You're gonna watch me struggle with technology, guys. It's always fun to see. Okay. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. All right. So let's get back to where we were. Were we here? Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about this, this apartheid wall that we're talking about. And I think that it's really important to really understand why the wall was erected and why all of a sudden now we're seeing it. And I think that one of the biggest things to understand is that this was in response to terror attacks that were happening in Israel. That's all this was an absolute response to terror attacks that were happening in Israel. And since its erection, 97% of the terror attacks that were coming from that part of the West Bank were thwarted. So that means only 3%, which is still too much, but 97% were stopped. And I throw it back at somebody who says to me, apartheid wall, it's horrible. People should be able to travel freely as much as they want. I always say to them, if 97% of terror attacks on Israeli citizens, and that includes Jews, Muslims, Arabs, whoever is in the state of Israel, if that's problematic for you and saving lives is problematic for you, that's a you problem. That's not a me problem. And I'm not going to fight that for you. If you can come up with a better way to stop that without having to, put Israeli lives in danger, I'm all ears. But that usually never happens. So against Zionism, but claim to champion human rights, you're a hypocrite because Zionism is a human right. It is a human right. If you champion indigenous rights, which is a human right, then you have to champion Zionism. Okay, we've been through that. Now, so we've been, we kind of been discussing Zionism and what Zionism is, and the Zionism that you're not going to hear about. My screen went weird. And the Zionism that you're not going to hear about when you are, most often on campus. And it was, can you guys see the screen or is it too? Do you see this?
Yes, we can.
Do you see the full screen? Because it kind of disappeared on me now.
You see your slides.
Technology. You see the slides. You can see the full slide here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's talk about LGBT rights as it refers to Israel and Zionism, and why is Zionism, basically a part of, or should really push forward and celebrate LGBT rights. So if we understand Zionism to be the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in our indigenous homeland, as it refers to LGBT rights, this was, always a challenge. We're still talking, guys, about the Middle East. We're still talking about a country that much of its tradition and law is based in religious law. We're still seeing a lot of this. So we have to kind of come to the terms with the fact that is as forward thinking as we want to be, as much as we want to think that LGBT rights should have been kind of an easy thing, it wasn't. We lived in a different time in 1948 for sure. And we're only starting to see now a lot of countries, the US included, kind of accepting, embracing LGBT rights in Israel. So let's talk about the timeline, because I think the timeline is important. While we're talking about the timeline, guys, I want you to keep in mind the entire time that we are talking about the Middle East. We are talking about a country that is surrounded by other countries that still shoot LGBT people, that still hang LGBT people, that still throw LGBT people off roofs. This is a neighborhood that is a tough neighborhood when it comes to LGBT rights. You've heard me say this before. I'm sure those of you who haven't heard me speak, I always like to say, Israel is like a nice house in a crappy neighborhood. It's this great place where it has all these freedoms and all these liberties, but everybody around us is not that. So, a lot of the people who came into Israel or returned to Israel, don't forget, guys, were Mizrahi Jews or Sephardi Jews, and even at that time, Ashkenazi Jews didn't have the most progressive views when it came to LGBT rights. So criminalization of LGBT rights in Israel was from 1948 all the way up until 1988. Now that's criminalization, but the important thing to notice is, even though in 1988 it was decriminalized, there was never a trial or a charge against any person who engaged in homosexual activity in Israel on the books since 1963. So even though it was criminal until 1988, 1963, already courts were not, or police were not charging people because of their sexual orientation. Don't ask, don't tell. So don't ask, don't tell, for me personally, somebody who served in the Army, is a big one. And Hallie started off by saying, I served openly gay sergeant in the IDF. This was in the mid-90s, guys. So in the mid-90s, in 1995, when I went into the Army, don't ask, don't tell was still in effect. And as, I guess, as prevalent as it was, or as it was in the US or in Canada or in kind of, a lot of the nations that are more Western nations, it was, in Israel, you're talking about this kind of macho, very kind of Middle Eastern mentality when it comes to men in the army, women in the army as well, but men in the army specifically, especially when it comes to LGBT rights. In 1996, it was when Don't Ask, Don't Tell came off the books. I mean, people said if you are LGBT, you are still able to serve in the IDF. When I went into the IDF, it was the last year I had a friend who was openly gay as well, and he just didn't want to serve because he was really scared of what the repercussions were going to be in Israel. And the repercussions at that time were, I guess, for some people too much. And it was still at that time in 1995, or just at the beginning of 1996, you could go to the doctor and say, I'm gay, I don't want to go to the army. That was enough reason for them to let you go. Nowadays, no. It's there's no debate. It's mainstream. It's accepted. It's fine. But 1996 is still, guys. Think about when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in the U.S. It's still light years ahead of so many of the countries in the West, and certainly light years ahead of our neighborhood. So Israel is pretty progressive, and you can see this in kind of the decriminalization started in 1988, but no homosexual crimes were charged, I guess, since 1963. That's a big deal, especially in the Middle East. So equality under the law. In Israel, no matter what your sexual orientation is, you are equal under the law, and to discriminate against somebody because of their sexual orientation is 100% illegal, and that is punishable by law. So that's a great thing to understand also, because I know that you shouldn't always compare, but I want you to remember all these things that we're talking about. It seems like it's in this short kind of half an hour chat, it's very quick, but this was over 72 years. There are countries in the world that are much older, or modern states in the world that are much older, that still kill LGBT people. So we are definitely an oasis for LGBT populations. Now, discrimination based on sexual orientation that we said, but I do want to talk about marriage and adoption, because these are the two big things that I think that if we're not honest about them, then kind of our whole discussion goes out the door. I said to you guys before, if you're going to have this discussion with people, you have to be willing to be honest about the hard things as well. And two of the big issues that we are still having as an LGBT population within Israel is marriage and adoption. Now, marriage, oddly enough, for those of you who might not know, I'm going to actually turn this off because we don't need this anymore. You can turn my sharing off. What a lot of people don't know is that marriage is not illegal for LGBT people because they're LGBT people. Marriage in Israel is illegal for LGBT people because there is no civil marriage in Israel, which is really important. When we talk about marriage in Israel, all the marriages that happen in Israel, whether Jewish, Muslim, Christian, whatever they are, they're religious ceremonies. Only religious ceremonies can happen as a legal marriage in Israel. There's no civil marriage. So under no religion, as we know so far yet, certainly not the big ones in Israel, not Judaism, not Christianity, not Islam, are any of those religions going to accept a same-sex marriage within their religion. So that is why, guys, same-sex marriage is not allowed in Israel. It is not in any way specifically geared towards discrimination against the LGBT population. That doesn't mean we don't have to change it. That's one of the things that I continue to fight for, is civil marriage in Israel, because it's very difficult, not only for somebody like me, but it's also difficult for an Israeli, let's say for example, who marries somebody from outside of Israel that's not Jewish. A Jewish ceremony has to be due to Jewish people. They won't do it. They're not going to get married under the Islamic law. They're not going to get married under the Christian law. But the silver lining, I guess you can call it, is although you cannot perform those marriages legally within the state of Israel, you can go outside of the borders of Israel and get married legally in whatever country allows same-sex marriages, and bring that marriage certificate back to Israel, and the state of Israel will recognize your marriage as 100% equal as any other marriage within the state. That's a great thing, but it can be difficult. And I'm just going to leave you with this when we talk about the marriage, is because divorce. So the sad part of talking about marriage is sometimes got to talk about divorce as well. And for people who have had these marriages outside of Israel, getting a divorce in Israel is impossible. Because if you were married civilly, there's no religious court that will divorce you because you were never married in a religious ceremony. So within Israel, if you want to get a divorce after being married civilly, you have to go back outside of Israel again, sign the divorce papers, whatever it is in the country that you got married in, and then bring those papers back to Israel, and then they'll divorce you. It's hard, it's a lot, but it's a lot further ahead than where we used to be, and certainly a lot further ahead than, you know, our neighbors. And then finally, guys, you know, I really
One second. Hey, Shai? Shai, can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Let's do it off your iPad. I'm sending you a request to enable
Sorry,
video.
do it on my iPad?
Yeah. You should get a request. Thank you for bearing with us, guys.
Sorry, guys. I'm technologically. Oh, okay, wait. What am I doing? You want me? Oh, this is just a screen share.
Yeah, but that's okay.
What am I doing here?
Okay.
Is it?
I got your feedback on your phone now, too.
We got it? Okay, cool.
All right, perfect. We got you, both screens.
Perfect. Okay.
These services are in very high demand right now, so we apologize.
Yeah. All right, let me just go back to this. Okay, yes. So let's talk for a second, and then we'll finish it off and get to Q&A, guys. Marriage, sorry, not marriage, children. So when we talk about adopting children in Israel, if you are a same-sex couple, I am hearing a really bad feedback.
There you go. I got it.
Hello?
We should hear you now, Shai.
Okay, perfect. So when we talk about children and being able to adopt in Israel, that's one of the challenges that the LGBT community are having right now, because it's not so much being able to adopt. Again, you can go outside of Israel and do most things and then come back to Israel and the country will recognize it. But it's really expensive. I mean, I have a couple friends, you know, a couple where they were married, same-sex couple who decided to do surrogacy outside of Israel, because surrogacy for same-sex couples inside Israel is illegal. And it cost them close to $500,000 to, once all was said and done, to have their baby. And of course, they're happy and they wouldn't change anything in the world. But for people who don't have that money, you know, it's impossible and it's almost unfair. So not almost, it is unfair. So we're fighting for that now as well. Of course, in Israel, there is something called holut mishutefet, which is sometimes a, you know, gay man and perhaps a gay woman will come together. We're friends. We want to have a child. We don't want to be in a relationship. Holut mishutefet means, you know, parents coming together and kind of parenting together, combined parenting. And what that's able to do then is at least give these two people the biological child that they were looking for within the legalities of Israel. Because to adopt same-sex couples, they won't let same-sex couples adopt unless it's very, very, very rare. And surrogacy, and this is something that was in the news in the past couple of years. Surrogacy in Israel was the big one. A heterosexual couple can hire a surrogate in Israel for a child. A same-sex couple cannot. So what I feel about surrogacy is completely separate, and we don't need to talk about the surrogacy itself. I just want to talk about the fact that we still need to fight for the right for LGBT couples to be able to be equal to heterosexual couples when it comes to surrogacy laws. All right, guys, so that was my spiel about Zionism and kind of LGBT rights and where we are in Israel and what we're seeing right now in Israel. But I want to throw this back to you guys because I know you always have some amazing questions. Douglas, you can turn off the iPad if you want now because we don't need that anymore. And we can just get to some questions so I can see maybe what you guys are saying.
All right. Looks like my video is not working. Oh, wait, there we go. Awesome. I'm in. Cool. Shai, thank you so much, as always. That was fantastic. You know your stuff, man. I think that's
Thank you.
yeah, of course. I think that's pretty clear to everyone on the call today. Yeah, and thank you everyone for being with us today. This has been a lot of fun. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Zach. I'm Camera's campus advisor and online editor, and I'll be doing the Q&A today. So let's get started. We have some good questions in here. I will pull up the chat box. So, okay, let's see. This is a great question. So the question is, how can the pro-Israel community fight against discrimination against Zionists within the LGBT community, such as the Dyke March in Chicago, I believe, which banned Jewish pride flags because they might offend someone?
Right. So, I think that the key here is going to be very much, like I said at the beginning, is going to be education. I mean, a lot of these, I think we need to be honest about the fact that a lot of these people who are banning, Jewish participants or Zionist participants are doing it because they've understood that Zionism is this, when it's really this. So that's why, I started off by saying, and I cannot reiterate enough, that we need to reclaim that word. We need to take it back, and we need to make sure that we understand Zionism to be what it is. I have found my best success when it comes to LGBT spaces and being accepted as somebody who, fights for Jewish indigenous rights is once I've said to somebody, I'm willing to listen to what you say. I will listen to everything that you have to say, but that same courtesy, I just ask that you extend to me. So you might have to sit there and listen to somebody say to you, whatever, all the horrible things that you might want to hear about, that somebody might say about, can you guys see me? Yeah. All the horrible things that you might think or hear that somebody says to you about LGBT rights within Israel, whether it's pink washing, whether it's all the different things that you're going to hear, and you might have to sit through and listen to it. But doing that paves the way for you to be able to then have a conversation and say, okay, I've heard what you've said, but now let me explain something to you as it pertains to LGBT rights, as it pertains to, Israel, as it pertains to whatever. I know that when we first started to see the things that were happening, especially like in the Chicago Dyke March, when they were saying people with Magen Davids can't come into, the march because that's a symbol of Zionism. These are all things that really just go to speak to what I just said. These are people who do not know, who do not have the facts about what they're talking about. They are jumping on a bandwagon now. That seems to be like the cool thing to do. Hating on Israel is like the cool thing to do now. And they're jumping on this bandwagon thinking that they understand what it is that they are bringing to the table as it pertains to Jews and Zionism and Israel. But they don't. And that one kind of comment about, again, a Star of David being a Zionist symbol really goes to prove that, because that's the most ridiculous thing that any Jewish person will tell you. So when it comes right down to it, there are going to be people who are going to say no Zionists allowed. There are going to be people like that. And I, for one, those of you who know me know it's very difficult for me to walk out of a room that I was having a debate with somebody and feel as though I didn't win the debate. It took me years to get to the point where I now am comfortable with the fact that it's not my favorite, but I'm comfortable with the fact that I can walk out of a talk and I can maybe not have 100% of the people say to me, oh, yes, you're right. We didn't understand. Now we understand. It's a lot better. I am comfortable with the fact that I'll walk out of that talk and maybe half of the people, maybe more, don't even, they don't agree with anything I said. They still believe what they want to believe. But I've planted a seed in terms of the way in which they're going to think about the next conversation that they have. When they're with their friends, they're, anti-Israel or anti-Zionist friends, are saying, I went to this lecture and I heard this guy talk and he said all these stupid things, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That might start a conversation between those people and say, oh, wait, what do you mean? Zionism isn't, I thought Zionism was this. Wait, it's not that? So even if we're able to start that conversation, just plant that seed and get things going, it's going to really help. And that is all the more true in LGBT spaces. LGBT spaces are very sensitive spaces. You have to remember that these are spaces that are not super old. This is kind of a new thing that people are really embracing the LGBT community the way that they are. And there are still a lot of emotions, raw emotions within the LGBT community as pertains to the way in which others interact with one another. When you don't understand what Zionism is, and it sounds like what people are, one group of people are choosing a specific other group of people who happen to be a minority in that country and are saying, we're going to do whatever we need to do to get you out of here. That hits a nerve with a lot of LGBT people because that's what, we grew up with. You don't want to be around us. We don't want to be around you, so on and so forth. Now, a lot of this is, we're kind of coming to terms with the fact that it is now accepted, but there's still all these hurt feelings inside. So when it comes to that, you can only plant a seed. You can only say, I hear what you're saying. You don't want me at your march because Zionism is whatever you think it is. But as somebody who subscribes to the right of, indigenous rights, do you believe that Jews or that I have the indigenous rights to self-determination? If you believe that, I don't care if you use the word Zionism. Don't use the word Zionism if that person that you're talking to. You never have to say that word. As long as you believe that Jews have indigenous rights like the same rights LGBT people should have, the same rights that anybody should have, then you and I are golden. There's nothing to dispute. But this really goes back again to reclaiming that word, taking that word back, because I find that the tension comes much further, comes a lot lower when I'm in an LGBT space and I don't bring up the word Zionism right at the beginning. You got to know your room, right? Know your audience. Know when to use that word. Know when to use that word. So if you have to start off talking about, oh no, I'm just about indigenous rights, about people, having self-determination, all those things, it's very rare that you're going to find an LGBT person who's going to say, I don't believe in indigenous rights. I don't believe in any of that. And then what you've done is, okay, so you believe in indigenous rights, great. Okay, you believe in, a people's right to self-determination, fantastic. Can I tell you something? You believe in Zionism. And it just kind of, it brings it back to a point where whether or not they agree with you or whether or not they jump at you and say, I don't agree with that, you planted a seed. So again, to reiterate, best thing you can do, guys, is know your audience. Know that you cannot change everybody's mind. Yes, you should still fight to do it, but take the small wins. Whether it's one person who said, hey, I never knew that fact before, and it could be something completely mundane, you've still planted a seed that hopefully is going to grow into germinate into something different.
Yeah, thank you, Shai. There's so much in there, and that's all really important, especially for people who want to have these conversations on college campuses, especially. And I think, yeah, I think what you're saying, a lot of it just comes down to education. All we can do is we can just passionately talk about what we believe in, and we can share our values with other people. And you're right, you're not going to change everyone's mind instantly, but right. Yeah, you can plant that seed there, and you can do just a little bit. And even if you do only a little bit to get somebody to think about an issue maybe in a way they haven't before, you've done your job and you've done something great. Okay.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's move on to something else here. Let's see what we got. Okay, this is an interesting question. We have a question coming in from Rafi Cohn. Thank you, Rafi. And it's about, it asks whether you can address the issue of humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. Generally?
The wording of the question exactly is, can you please talk about the conditions in the Gaza Strip and the humanitarian crises accusations?
Okay, so great, because Gaza is definitely kind of it's a huge talking point now, anywhere in the world. The minute you bring up Israel, that's the first thing that people say, Gaza, horrible things happening in Gaza. And again, guys, I want you to be honest about it. Yes, horrible things are happening in Gaza. Yes, 100% horrible things are happening in Gaza. But let's remember, guys, that we are talking about humanitarian conditions that if Israel had all the leeway to do whatever they wanted in Gaza, great. We wouldn't see the problems that we're seeing now. But Israel doesn't. So you will get a lot of pushback from people who will say, oh, the humanitarian, don't give me all the history of it. I don't care about the history of it. I just want to know how we can fix all of this. But you cannot talk about how you can fix it if you don't know how we got there. So it's really important to understand, how did the situation end up the way that it ended up? You can look at what Gaza was pre-2005, when Israel withdrew from Gaza. The important facts that you need to put out there to people is Gaza is no longer occupied. Gaza hasn't been occupied since 2005. So here's our humanitarian issues. What led up to them? Well, what led up to it is, remember, in 2005, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, there was no blockade and there was no Hamas there yet. Hamas came into power in 2007. So what does that mean? There were 2 years that Israel had withdrew and things were still happening within the Strip. Before Israel withdrew, when Arabs and Jews were living within the Strip, we can say about it was a utopia. It was much better than what it is now. But then people will say to you, but it wasn't then. You didn't give it back to the Palestinians. Fine. Gaza was and always was a test to see what would happen if Israel said, okay, here you go, self-determination, self-control, self-governance, all of that stuff. Here you go. We will, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, we will leave you all of our agriculture. We will leave you all of our greenhouses. We will leave you all of our infrastructure. Not only will we leave it for you, we want to see you succeed so badly, we will teach you and educate you how to grow those greenhouses, how to keep those crops, how to do all the things that you need to do in order to be self-sustaining. Israel did that. That is what Israel said. What happened to the Strip? Hamas took over. It became a launching pad for rockets. You have to remember also, and I like to remind people, that 2007, when the rockets started to come in, I mean, why was the blockade put into effect? People think the blockade was put into effect as some sort of a collective punishment. No, the blockade was put into effect as a response to Hamas smuggling weapons into Gaza. So if that's a response, great. So what we need to understand is humanitarian issues are, what are the humanitarian issues in Gaza? For sure, education, for sure, infrastructure, for sure, water, for sure, well, that's infrastructure, for sure, freedom of movement, all these things. But all these things are the way that they are now because of one thing, because of the governance of a terror organization within the Strip. So people will say to me, all those states are fine, perfect, I don't know what, that's great. It's still a problem. Yes, it's still a problem. So where does that leave us? If people are saying Israel has no right to go in there to fix it, but Israel can't also, how is Israel supposed to live next to this piece of land that attacks it? What is the solution? What do we need to do? I think if I was the king of the world and I could decide what was happening, or if I was the president or the prime minister of Israel, what I would say is I would personally, I know a lot of Arab states now are really kind of distancing themselves from the Palestinians because what they're saying is this is a lost war. This was something that we didn't want the Jews here at the beginning. We now understand that this is actually good for us. So we're happy to have them here. We're not going to fight this war anymore. That really didn't mean anything to us anyway. Yesterday I was watching, it was like a hashtag, something going around on Twitter about how Arab states are saying, I'm distancing myself from the Palestinian conflict because it doesn't affect me. So where are we now? We are with this group of people who are being governed by one side of it, a terror organization, the other side of it, an elected government that is now in its 15th year of its four-year term. And these people, at the end of the day, it's the people who are suffering. So do I feel badly, and should we feel badly for the citizens of Gaza or for the citizens of the West Bank? Yes. Yes. I mean, it's a horrible situation that they're in, but we have to understand where it came from. So when people say humanitarian, what can we do? How do we need to do it? I absolutely 100% think that, and this is just me, that, it would help if there was kind of like an Arab League, not the Arab League, but a Arab League that would somehow kind of, I don't know, give maybe a guarantee, or kind of say, you know what, we will guarantee that there's no weapons, no Hamas, no whatever, for a span of 10 years, a decade, and then let's see where we are. And then, they can worry about giving or helping Palestinians to self-govern and whatever it is that happens after. I want to reiterate and emphasize, never, ever shy away from a question about humanitarian rights when it comes to Gaza, because it just makes your argument look less honest. You have to be honest about the fact that stuff is happening there. But on the flip side, just for you guys to know, because I love this account, there's a great account on Twitter, and there's a hashtag called the Gaza You Don't See. Hashtag the Gaza You Don't See. And I can't remember the person's name who actually runs the account, but it's an account that actually just shares videos and kind of footage from within Gaza that really goes and blows the whole idea of what people say Gaza is out of the water. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are humanitarian issues. Yes, all these things exist. But in terms of Israel, in terms of what we can do, we are doing the best that we can with the situation at hand. We allow people to come into Israel to get medical treatment. We have, Mahsom Erez, which is the crossing into Gaza, Kojak, well, days and trucks and foods and, you know, all those things are going in. When they say, but what about humanitarian issues? You know, COVID right now, Israel has a blockade. Israel does not blockade anything into the Strip that cannot be used as a weapon. No medical supplies, no medical ventilators, none of that. So people will just throw that at you and say there's a complete block. Well, that's untrue. That's a fallacy. You know, so if you want to be honest about the conversation, let's be honest about it and understand why certain things can't get through, but why certain things can. So Rafi, you know, sum it up again. Don't shy away from the question. Definitely speak to it, but speak to it factually. And this is like a hot topic for a lot of people, because a lot of people will say, I don't care anything you have to say, there are Palestinians who are dying. Okay, yes, there are, and there are also Israelis who are dying, and there are also, you know, there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can look at this. But I think it's really, really important to talk to each humanitarian issue that you're looking at. Don't just give it a broad brushstroke and say, this is, you know, this is the issue. This is why the situation is that it is. And remind people that in terms of what the sovereign state of Israel is doing for another country, Gaza is not Israel. So what Israel is doing for Gaza is humanitarian efforts. Anything that we do to help is a humanitarian effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And I think the fact that you brought up Hamas is so important. And that's something that I think people need to be honest about, because that is, as most of us probably know here, an anti-Semitic terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel that has murdered over 1,000 people in cold blood. So when people talk, especially on college campuses, about the blockade, they don't have empathy, sympathy. I don't know what the right word is. They don't acknowledge the position Israel is in, where they have to help the 2 million innocent people in the Strip while also defending themselves from a terrorist organization. So
number one, and then also don't forget, guys, this is kind of that point that people like to sweep under the rug. The blockade is not only in effect from Israel, it's in effect by Egypt as well. So Gaza borders Egypt, guys. Remember that there are two countries who have a problem with what's happening in the Strip, not only Israel. Nobody likes to talk about the Egyptian part of it because it just, you know, it doesn't play into a narrative. But we got to be honest about it. Egypt was having terror tunnels dug into their, you know, into their country as well. They too were seeing things that were happening because of Hamas. So let's be honest about it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're going to do one more question, and then if anyone has more questions that they think of later that we don't have time to get to, what you can do is you can write in your question in the discussion board on the event page for this event. On Camera on Campus's Facebook page, go to the events tab, find this event, write your question in there, and then we can find a way to get it to Shai, and he can address that question later. So the question that I want to close out here with, Shai, is it deals with the issue of nationalism. So I think it's fair to say that Zionism really is Jewish nationalism. It's in its current form, it's resulted in Israel, which is the nation state of the Jewish people. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is on college campuses, the word nationalism has a very negative connotation to it because it's very exclusivist and particularistic in an environment that I think politically emphasizes universalism a lot more. So how do we talk about nationalism and make the case for Jewish nationalism in an environment where nationalism is a bad word?
So I think that, you know, that's a great point, because I think a lot of times, especially when I start to do these talks, I mean, the word nationalism, as I would use it or I've used in the past, had never ever come out of my mouth with a connotation meaning like what a lot of people, you know, perceive it to be. I think that when you look at German nationalism, let's say, for example, during the Nazi time versus a nation state, is two completely separate things. So if we're talking about nationalism as like a superiority kind of complex, as the Aryan people in the Nazi camp saw, we are German nationalists. We want blonde hair, blue eyes, Aryan race. This is who we are. That is obviously that's bad. But what I think we're talking about here, and I think that there needs to be some sort of a coming together between patriotism and nationalism, as opposed to nationalism as in hate. So you should absolutely, I mean, you know, it's up to you, of course, but you know, if you love the country that you're from, if you love your country, you should definitely be patriotic. I don't see that being a problem. I think that we really need to make sure that if we use that word nationalism in terms of, I've stopped using it because it's so, there's way too many people who will take it to the bad side of it. And rather, I say the nation state of the Jewish people isn't the nationalism that you're talking about. If we look at, and I started off the conversation with this, if we look at the majority of the globe, not including South America, I say the New World, not including South America or North America, most of the world is created and has nation states of their indigenous peoples. That is never, has or ever, you know, of course it's been a problem in the past, but today as we see it, I don't see people protesting Italy should be not Italian. I don't see people saying, you know, France shouldn't be French. None of those people are saying those things because the nation state, what is that nation state? It is a state based on the traditions of the ethnic people who you know, started that country or who are from that land and indigenous to that land, but still open and democratic and free to anybody who wants to live there. You know, you can be the nation state of the Jewish people and still be the homeland of every single non-Jew who wants to live there. You're Israeli. If you're Israeli, that doesn't mean that you can't be Jewish, or if you're not Jewish doesn't mean you can't be Israeli. These are two things that, you know, they don't conflict one another. They can absolutely work together. So I think that it's really important that when we talk about the nation state, let's understand. Sometimes I find that if you say the nation state and then throw out all the other examples, like all of Europe, all of Africa, all, you know, everywhere else basically in the Far East, if you use those countries as an example as to, these are all nation states, all of them, and they all, you know, well, not all, but most of them have the ability, or at least the opportunity, for somebody who's not part of that ethnic indigenous population to live there. Why should Israel be any different? Why should it? The entire Middle East is sectarian. The entire Middle East is built up of sects of, you know, Arab communities within the Arab communities, and that seems to be okay. But for some reason, the one sect, the Jewish sect or the Jewish people, they never seem to get a break when it comes to being able to say, well, I just want what everybody else has. Here's a nation state. Everybody around us is a nation state. We just want the same thing. We don't want to take rights away from anybody. We don't want anybody to be not equal. Like I say, guys, 20% of our population, Arab, fully equal citizens, serve in the IDF, on the Supreme Court, sit in the Knesset. The third largest party in Israel is the Joint Left, Reshima Meshutefet, which is, I mean, we don't need to talk about them. Not people that I would ever want to have on, you know, in a government in Israel. And democratically, they were elected. This is who we are. So you can talk from now until the end of time about how nationalism is a bad thing. That's, yes, let's not talk about that word, because that word today, in today's context, has a negative tone to it. Let's instead talk about the nation state of the Jewish people with equal rights for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Great points. And I think a lot of it comes down to double standards against Israel. You brought up the fact that there are so many other nation states with kind of similar structures that make them up in South America or Europe. There are European nations with crosses on their flags, you know? So
I don't know any Muslim country that doesn't have somewhere in their flag or on their state emblem or something, they have the moon. So why is the Star of David so problematic? And that, right, yeah, I think it's down to anti-Semitism, and you guys know that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, unfortunately, that's about all the time we have tonight. Everyone, as I said before, if there are other questions you come up with, you know, out of nowhere at 4 a.m, write them on the discussion board of the Facebook page for the event, and we will try to get them to Shai as quickly as possible so he can answer them for you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Shai. It was great as always. Great to see you. Hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yes.
Everyone, college students who may be on this call, if you would like to be more involved with the Camera on Campus programs, which you absolutely should, you should look into our fellowship program. We're retweaking our fellowship program a little bit. We're going to have different tracks this upcoming year that you can apply for. It's still in the works a little bit, but I promise you, we are working on the details, and at some point soon, we're going to have more concrete information out for you. but we focus a lot on writing op-eds. That's kind of our specialty. We host, we help you put on events. We help you form responses to anti-Israel activity and propaganda on campuses. We love working with students. That's what we're here to do. If you guys want to be involved or know of any other college students, have other friends on college campuses who want to get involved, please reach out to anybody on the Camera on Campus team, Facebook, email, whatever. We will be happy to get in touch with you. We love talking with people. That's what we're here to do. So thank you everybody very much for joining us, and have an awesome night.
Thanks, guys.